Hi, and welcome to another episode of Metal Mastermind. I'm your host, Ken Candelas, and I am the Mad Composer. I'm also an educator and professional recording engineer here in New York City. I have a ton of experience teaching students, and today I want to actually talk about something that I think is a little bit underrepresented in the audio community, and that is power. Power is kind of an interesting thing because it's not necessarily something that's well understood by a lot of audiophiles. I mean, you might be very well, suited and understanding power, but you maybe not. And for the longest of time, I wasn't. So it took a journey for me to understand what power really was and how it actually affected my sound. And after hearing proof, I can definitely say I know a little bit more about power than I did before. So one of the things that I'd like to address first is how is your line stable? So where you live or where you operate might determine the kind of power that's in the infrastructure. In a commercial building, you might be lucky enough to have something called triple phase or three-phase power. This is to help sustain the voltage so that you have more voltage essentially at the ready at all times versus single phase, which is, a one-wave, very typical thing that we would see for all residents. At the breaker, that's where you're going to be able to control how that gets distributed into your home, and that's where you see all those circuits, right? And they could be with a numeric value printed on them. They usually are with like 15 amps, 20 amps, depending, or you might have more or less. Now, these sorts of circuits help to divide what kind of total load, right? Like, for example, think of a truck. How many packages can fit into that truck, right? What's the total load, right? So if we're talking about electricity, we usually represent that with current. Now, if you think about current as a big river or a small creek, right? The big river is going to have a lot more flow. It's going to have a lot more molecules. There's literally more force within all of that. So with a bigger circuit, you will have also more at the ready, more to draw from, more force going through essentially the system. So having something like 20 amps or 30 amps for a dedicated studio space is very typical. And also don't forget that the wiring itself matters, right? How thick the wire is really essentially for how much current can it handle. The bigger the river, right? The bigger that canal is going to have to be. So in these cases, hopefully that makes sense. Now, when it comes to how everything flows together, right, electricity kind of runs like a race car track. The ignition is going to be the starter. That's sort of like your hot pin on an electrical plug, and that's going to go through your device and go to the return, which is our neutral. Okay, so it goes in, right, to the device, and then out of the device back into the entire circuit, which is the neutral wire going back, and it completes the circuit. The ground helps us to establish always a path for electricity to exit. That way we don't get, ground loops and hums and all that kind of stuff. So when you don't have something that's properly grounded, actually, that's why you hear a buzz, right? It goes like, right, when you just turn it on, because that ground loop hasn't drained. It doesn't have a place to exit, so you have to force it to. And that's why in things like DI boxes, you'll see a ground lift in order to create that breakage so that there is a ground for the signal to not have a hum in it anymore. So these types of things are power-based. It really is electricity in a circuit as it runs. And you might think about different things to help protect your devices when talking about such things. For example, like an uninterruptible power supply, for example, is a battery that basically stays on. It takes in the incoming alternating current from the wall, turns it into DC to fill up the battery, and that battery then has an inverter that converts that DC into AC for its sockets so that it can power the rest of your devices. And some of them also have a voltage regulator, so it will take the power that's inside the battery and help it to eliminate any fluctuations of that voltage so you get a stable output. That's pretty awesome. And these might also, in some cases, have a bit of power conditioning attached to that. Power conditioning comes in many forms. Some people will just use a transformer, which is not really conditioning at all. It's more of like building a bodyguard for your entire circuit. It creates something called a Faraday cage, which basically, as with magnetic forces, it can actually repel incoming strays of information between the outside versus the inside. So if you got a bodyguard at the club, right, it's gonna let only the people that are supposed to come in and not the riffraff, so to speak. So that's an isolation transformer, but conditioning is actually something that involves filtering, which can be used with something like capacitors. So when you have things like capacitors versus transformers, transformers are the things, like I said, they're sort of blockages for certain parts of the signal. They're also great at stepping up and stepping down voltage, so you get the right amount of voltage for your system. But they're also, with capacitors, they vary where capacitors can hold a charge, and that charge can be used at any point, right? So if you have a capacitor holding charge, it also in a way acts similar to like that battery concept, where it could always be using that information, and the bigger the capacitor, the more it can be used for things like power amps and stuff like that, for big draws of load right there. And those kinds of cases, power is very important. Right? So having a stable voltage and not having something that's going to choke your system, right? When you choke your system, it starts to affect the size of the soundstage, and it starts to diminish. It starts to get smaller, right? Think of it as if you were like losing your hearing, right? It's almost like it's just feeling a little less full of life. I mean, that's a pretty dark way of putting it. But this is metal, right? So in that case, all of this comes down to, right, do you have the proper amount of current draw coming for all of your equipment? Usually for a small studio, there really isn't a lot. You probably don't even need more than 15 amps for the majority of studios that are home-based. And all that means is just, if you're going to have at home a dedicated power line for just your studio, that would be the best thing that you can do, even if it was just one circuit, just for starters, right? You get at least your computer, your sound system, and your interface and all that hooked up to one dedicated line that's away from things like refrigerators and lights and all that other stuff. You're going to do really well for yourself with just that alone. You won't even need the fancy stuff like isolation transformers, especially if you have a really good ground set up in your building. So if you need, though, because sometimes you do get from other users, right? Especially if you're in an apartment complex, you're probably going to get a lot of activity on those electrical lines from your neighbors, and what's being drawn at any point in time might be different during the day than it is during at night. So, right, your sound literally might actually be better at night, which is not really a problem for people who like to enjoy music, but if you're living in an apartment where other people are also sleeping, that might be a problem too. So this is one way of thinking about, well, hey, how can I, get the best power draw for all my devices at all times where it's not suffering? Right, and these are kind of ways that I'm thinking about it, right? So you got the isolation transformer, right? You also have the, uninterruptible power supply. You also can do this thing called balanced power. Really, really great company, Equitech, and other companies like Puritan, I believe, also do stuff like this. But these kinds of companies create balanced power, which basically takes the same concept of what you have with normal unbalanced audio, right? So you got a TS cable, tip, sleeve. Tip is the signal, sleeve is the ground, right? Well, if you only have one type of signal, okay, then it is subject to interference down the line the further it goes, like a big antenna, essentially. So with guitars, this is very common because obviously, it's just a single unbalanced cable going into an amplifier, and that amplifies the interference getting in. You hear the radio on your guitar amp. So that kind of interference is something that also happens in a way in power. So that kind of noise can actually be rejected. And in audio, we do this with balance cables, right? We have two signals for the ground, positive and minus. They're literally opposite ends of each other, right? They're flipped on each other. Because down the path, though they're out of phase, they're actually on two separate lines, so they don't actually interact with each other yet. And the interference is going to be shared exactly the same on one wire to the next, right? But when we get to the other side, the thing that's negative gets flipped into positive, which then restores the signal as it originally was from the start. And whatever noise that was picked up down the line, the one that flipped out of phase is in phase for music, but out of phase for the noise. It's genius. So we do the same here in balanced power with voltage. So rather than 120 volts on just one hot line, it takes that with a dual bridge rectifier to put it on a hot and a neutral, plus 60 and minus 60. And again, through something called common mode rejection is this phenomenon that we're talking about with balanced wires. Through common mode rejection, takes out any noise that's not supposed to be there. Isn't that amazing? So we have a lot of different tools. Now, does everything need it? Probably not. It all depends on where you live, what your setup looks like, how treated your power situation already is. I learned through a lot of heartache power issues because I was just, not even aware for, I think, like a good 3/4 of my entire career. I wasn't really truly aware of how important ground was for something like surge protection. It makes sense to me now, but a long time it took to realize that even if you have a surge protector, but the ground is lifted, it's not protecting things anymore. It's just an extension now. So, things like that actually teach you lessons, don't they? Well, I don't want you to go through the same pain that I did, and I want you to be aware that, yes, your power is important. To what degree? Well, that depends on how bad the situation is, right? So it can only be a case-by-case basis. No product is actually like a one-size-fits-all. So when you treat your power, you got to think about first the fundamental parts of how power operates. I also like to look at things like, plumbing examples to show water, because circuits run pretty much exactly the same way in water as they do with electricity. And those are ways to expand the things that maybe you don't know about, right? And to be a little bit more familiar with them. But that's all for today. This is such an amazing conversation to have, and we'll have more things like this down the road. And with Metal Mastermind, if you're looking to expand on a subject like this and actually want to learn how to build your own studio, well, I've got a course on that. It's called Metal Studio Designer, and it goes through all the dimensions of how to go through building your acoustic treatments, your reverb time, layouts and electrics with thermal readings, and how you can make sure that you get the right air conditioner for your space. All of this and more is going to be in Metal Studio Designer, and this is an opportunity for you to grab it while it's still at its current pricing. It's just an honor to always come here to Metal Mastermind and talk to you folks. I really appreciate all that you guys are doing in the community. I appreciate you spreading the word. I appreciate you guys for sticking around and believing in something that's bigger than all of us, which is something that I'm very passionate about. I've been an educator since 2019, and I don't intend to stop now. This is something that I want to do for my community, and I hope you guys are as passionate about metal as I am in order to want to do the same. So, without further ado, this is Ken Candelas signing off, and always remember to create your own sound.